Welcome to Season 3, Episode 5 of CSS Breakdown, book by book.
Great to be here.
Today we explore Chapter 5 of Michael Kimmel's The Gendered Society, where gender isn't something we are, it's something we do.
A really foundational idea in sociology.
In this episode, we unpack how gender is socially constructed, continually performed, and reinforced by the institutions around us. Okay, let's dive in.
Let's do it.
We're jumping into an idea that might feel a bit counterintuitive at first. The notion that gender isn't just some fixed, innate quality we're born with, like eye color or height.
Right. It's not that simple.
Instead, it's something dynamic, something that is deeply shaped by the world around us, by the society and the history we live in. It brings to mind that intriguing line Ralph Waldo Emerson is quoted as saying, which the source uses right at the beginning. Society is a masked ball where everyone hides his real character and reveals it by hiding.
That Emerson quote is perfect for setting the stage for the sociological perspective this chapter introduces. It really highlights how our identities, including gender, are complex and shaped by our social context.
Yeah, that reveals it by hiding part is interesting.
It is. The core idea here is C. Wright Mills's concept of the intersection of biography and history. The understanding that our individual lives, our personal stories, are always lived out within larger historical periods and social structures.
So they're not in a vacuum.
Exactly. We aren't just isolated individuals making choices, We are constantly responding to the world we encounter, and it's through that process of interaction within the frameworks of our social institutions that we actively construct who we are.
We build ourselves, in a way.
In a very real way. It's less about a predetermined biological path and more about how our individual paths are woven into the broader social fabric.
So sociology looks at gender not just as a personal trait, but as something embedded in time and place, influenced by those bigger historical and social forces. It's about seeing our personal experiences of gender as part of a larger pattern, right?
Precisely. And the sociological view integrates insights from other fields, but adds its own crucial layer. It builds on anthropology, acknowledging the incredible variability of gender expressions and roles across different cultures.
Which is huge.
Absolutely. It considers biology, recognizing biological imperatives exist, but it crucially argues that the source and expression of these imperatives are heavily influenced by the environment and social context, not purely dictated by the body alone.
So biology isn't destiny.
That's the sociological stance, yeah. And it touches on psychology's focus on individual drives for autonomy and connection. But the distinct sociological point is that our personal biographies and the sweep of history are fundamentally gendered.
And the jumping off point for this sociological perspective is a direct challenge to biological determinism. That idea that our gendered behavior is simply hardwired by our biology.
Precisely. The social sciences don't deny biological differences exist, but they critically examine the variations that exist among men and among women, not just the average differences between them.
The focus is different.
The emphasis is on understanding the social origins of the patterns we see in how men and women develop and behave. Where do these patterns come from?
And a powerful way the source illustrates the critical role of society and interaction is through those, stark stories of isolation.
Yes, these anecdotes, even if some are partly legendary, they really make you think. The story of Frederick II trying to find the natural language by raising infants in silence, who then tragically died, it suggests language and interaction are fundamental to survival itself.
Yeah.
Similarly, accounts of so-called feral children, supposedly raised by animals, who struggled or failed to integrate into human society, hint that just having a human body isn't enough to develop, human capacities.
And then there's the incredibly compelling case of Isabel.
Isabel's story is particularly well documented and powerful. She was kept hidden in isolation with her deaf-mute mother until she was 6 years old.
6 years old.
Yeah. When discovered, she couldn't speak beyond croaking sounds, was terrified of people, and moved and acted more like a wild animal. Really tragic.
But the remarkable part is her recovery.
It is. With intensive, dedicated training and socialization, she made rapid progress. By the time she was 14, she was attending school, functioning socially, and seemed genuinely happy.
That recovery is astonishing. It really underscores that even after profound deprivation, human interaction can fundamentally alter the trajectory of a person's development.
It suggests that while biology provides us with potential, it's the engagement with others, the process of socialization, that is absolutely essential for us to become who we are as social beings.
It's the interaction.
It's a strong counterpoint to the idea that everything about us is simply predetermined by our physical form. We are made in interaction, not just in isolation.
Now, talking about gender being socially constructed can sometimes be misunderstood. People might hear that and think, oh, great, society made me this way, so I'm not responsible for anything I do.
That's a very common misinterpretation, which the source labels reflexive passivity. It's a way of deflecting accountability.
Passing the buck.
Right. Or you get the opposite, impulsive hyper-individualism, the idea that if gender is constructed, you can just decide to be anything you want. Rules be damned.
Like it's all just a choice with no constraints.
Exactly. Both, the source argues, miss the sociological point entirely and are ways individuals avoid grappling with the complexities of their own agency within social structures.
So if it's not about being completely passive or completely free to invent yourself, what does social construction mean here?
It means that our identities, including our gendered identities, aren't like solid blocks of marble. They're more like dynamic, fluid assemblies that we build using the values, images, and expectations available to us in the world we inhabit. It's an ongoing process.
Building blocks from society.
Kind of. And crucially, our gendered identities are both voluntary. We do make choices. We have agency in how we present ourselves and who we aspire to be, and they are coerced. Society pressures us, sanctions us, sometimes even forces us into certain ways of being and expressing gender.
So it's both choice and constraint.
Yes. We aren't just inventing the rules, but we also don't fit neatly or easily into predefined roles.
And that experience of navigating these expectations varies hugely from person to person, right?
Absolutely. For some people, the dominant expectations align relatively well with their internal sense of self, and navigating gender feels like a smooth, almost effortless process.
They fit in easily.
Relatively, yes. For others, it can feel like a constant battle, like having to perform a role that is fundamentally at odds with who they feel they are inside, suppressing core parts of themselves just to be accepted or survive.
That sounds incredibly difficult.
It can be. And for most people, it's probably somewhere in between. There are aspects of their gender expression that feel authentic and empowering, and others that feel like obligations or performances that are felt as forced.
A mixed bag.
Yeah, a very mixed bag for many.
And the sociologist's task is to understand the mechanics of how these personal experiences, our interactions with others, and the larger institutions around us combine to shape that identity.
Precisely. Think of it this way. Biology provides the raw materials, the physical body, and its potentials. Society and history provide the context, the cultural models, the instruction manual, if you will, and the pressures that we use to build our identities from those materials.
Okay, so let's deepen our understanding of this social constructionist perspective. The source highlights 4 key ways in which gender definitions vary. First, they vary from culture to culture.
This is where anthropology is so vital. By looking at diverse societies around the world, we see that what it means to be a man or a woman is incredibly varied. There's no single universal definition. It's a product of specific cultural norms and practices.
No one way to do gender.
Not at all. Second, these definitions change over historical time within a single culture.
Right. History shows us that gender isn't static even within the same place. Ideas about masculinity and femininity in, say, 19th century America were very different from what they are today.
Massively different. Expectations for men's work, women's roles, even acceptable emotional expression have shifted dramatically.
Third, they vary over a person's own life course.
This is where developmental psychology's insights are helpful. The gendered issues and expectations you face as a young adult are different from those you encounter in middle age or old age.
That makes sense.
For example, a young woman might be navigating the challenges of entering the workforce and the dating scene, while an older woman might be dealing with menopause, retirement, or caregiving roles.
Different life stages, different gender issues.
For men, too. The pressure to prove themselves, achieve success, and provide often dominates their younger and middle years, but later in life, as the source meets with the grandparent effect, some men report a softening, becoming more interested in nurturing and caregiving roles.
Roles they felt less free to embrace when they were younger fathers.
Maybe. That's the idea. The external pressures or internal drives might shift, allowing different aspects of their personality to come forward, aspects that might previously have felt incompatible with dominant notions of masculinity.
Interesting. And fourth, definitions of masculinity and femininity vary within any one culture at any one time.
This is absolutely crucial and often overlooked. You can't just talk about a male or a female experience of gender. What it means to be a man or a woman is profoundly shaped by other aspects of your identity, your race, class, ethnicity, age, sexuality, education, region, and so on.
Intersectionality.
Exactly. The source uses the powerful example of how different the experience of being a man would be for an older gay black man living in Chicago compared to a heterosexual white teenager in rural Iowa. These intercepting identities create vastly different lived experiences of gender.
So while other fields show gender varies, what does sociology specifically add to this understanding?
Sociology adds three critical dimensions: difference, power, and the institutional level. On difference, sociology moves beyond just observing variation to analyzing the plurality of gender definitions, recognizing and exploring the multiple ways masculinity and femininity are understood and enacted across different groups.
Okay, so it's not just noting the differences, but understanding there's a whole spectrum, a plurality.
Yes. And then there's power. Sociology looks at how certain definitions of masculinity or femininity come to be seen as the standard, the normative.
The default setting?
Kind of. And this isn't a natural process. It happens through social struggles, through groups vying for influence and control, including the power to define what counts as normal or desirable gender expression.
And this is where it gets really interesting, the idea that power isn't just about who's in charge, but how power shapes the very language and concepts we use to understand gender.
Exactly. The dominant groups often have the power to define the terms, and those definitions can benefit them and disadvantage others. And the third dimension is the institutional one.
Right.
Sociology looks beyond just how individuals become gendered and then enter neutral spaces. It examines how institutions themselves, like families, schools, workplaces, political systems, are gendered.
They aren't neutral playing fields.
Not according to this perspective. They have embedded norms, expectations, and structures that reflect and reproduce gender relations. There's a dynamic interplay. Gendered individuals act within gendered institutions, and those institutions, in turn, shape individuals' identities and perpetuate gender inequality.
This brings us to a critique of earlier theories, like sex role theory, which was a dominant way of understanding gender for a long time, especially in social psychology.
Yes. Sex role theory focused heavily on individual development, how children learn their gender identity, primarily from parents and early experiences, and how they navigated conforming to cultural blueprints for masculine and feminine roles.
The focus was on the individual.
Very much so. And the internal consistency of their identity. But sociology found this approach insufficient to capture the complexity of gender as a social phenomenon.
Okay, so what were the problems?
Sociologists identified several key problems. One major issue is the term role itself. It can make gender sound too much like a costume or a part you play that can be easily shed, like a teacher role or a friend role.
But it's deeper than that.
Much deeper. Sociologists like Helena Lapata and Barry Thorne argued that gender, much like race or age, is far more fundamental and less easily changed. It deeply infuses other roles. A female teacher might experience her teacher role very differently from a male teacher due to gendered expectations about authority, nurturing, or even pay and status within the educational institution itself.
So treating gender as just a role diminishes its power.
Exactly. It minimizes gender's profound impact on structuring people's lives. Okay, so that's one problem.
What is the second?
Sex role theory tended to assume there was a single universal standard for the male sex role and the female sex role. It ignored the vast variation within gender categories.
The plurality you mentioned earlier.
Right. It didn't adequately account for how factors like race, class, sexuality, or age shape very different experiences of masculinity and femininity. The source points out that early studies often treated people who didn't fit this narrow standard, like black men, gay men, or lesbians, as having sex role problems, framing their differences as deviations from the normal role.
When in fact they were just
different.
Or responding to different circumstances.
Exactly. They were navigating gender differently due to intersecting social identities and oppressions. The theory mistook the normative for the normal.
So it mistakenly treated a dominant or normative way of doing gender as the universal normal.
Precisely. This false universalism failed to explain how that particular norm became dominant in the first place, and it dismissed or pathologized the rich diversity of gender experiences.
Whereas sociology sees those differences differently.
Sociology, conversely, sees differences among masculinities and femininities as outcomes of how groups interact with their specific social environments, including systems of inequality. The ways black men or older Latinas express gender differently aren't deviations from a universal norm. They are products of their unique experiences within a structured social world.
That reframing is really powerful. How about the third problem?
Sex role theory tended to view gender as two separate, parallel categories, masculine and feminine, as if they existed in isolated boxes. Like corrals, the source says.
Separate pens.
Right. It didn't adequately capture the relational nature of gender. As sociologists Judith Stacy and Barry Thorne noted, the role framework gives an abstract view, not a concrete one of the relations between them.
They're defined against each other.
Often, yes. Masculinity and femininity are frequently defined in relation to each other. Studies consistently show that men's ideas of manhood are often constructed in constant reference to what is considered feminine. The source points out that anti-femininity, defining oneself as a man by rejecting anything considered womanly, is perhaps the most widespread characteristic across different groups of men.
So you can't understand one without understanding its dynamic opposition or relationship to the other. It's not just two separate lists of traits.
Precisely. And fourth, because gender is plural and relational, it's also highly situational. Sex role theory struggled to explain why gendered behavior changes so much depending on the context.
The situation matters.
Hugely. As Deborah Rode put it, boys may be boys. But they express that identity differently in fraternity parties than in job interviews with a female manager. Gender isn't just an internal trait you express uniformly. It's a set of behaviors that are produced and adapted based on the specific social situation and institutional context you're in.
And sex role theory would likely see those situational variations as individual inconsistencies rather than a core feature of how gender is actually done.
Right. It implicitly assumes deviations or problems with the individual, not reflections of the fluid, situational nature of gender expression. And this brings us to the fifth and perhaps most significant critique. Sex role theory fundamentally depoliticized gender.
Depoliticized, how so?
By framing gender as individual attributes or roles, it stripped away the historical and political context. It neglected the fundamental role of power and conflict in shaping gender relations.
It missed the power dimension.
Completely. By focusing on roles, it implicitly suggested a complementary model, separate but equal, which obscured the reality of pervasive gender inequality. Stacy and Thorne argue you simply cannot talk about gender without talking about power.
It's unavoidable.
It is. Not all ways of being masculine or feminine are equally valued or powerful in society. Sociologist R.W. Connell's concepts of hegemonic masculinity and emphasized femininity highlight how certain normative constructions become dominant models against which others are measured and often found subordinate.
So, by presenting gender as just individual roles, sex role theory not only ignored power, but could inadvertently reproduce the dominant norms by treating them as the standard.
Exactly. The hegemonic definition of masculinity, for example, subordinates other men, those who are seen as too effeminate, too young, or gay. Part of knowing gender involves defining oneself in opposition to these devalued others.
Setting up an us versus them?
In a way, yes. Sociology, unlike sex role theory, is centrally interested in how these power dynamics operate, how norms are established and negotiated, and how gender tensions aren't just individual struggles with abstract expectations, but conflicts between groups operating within social institutions.
It's about groups and structures, not just individuals.
At its core, the sociological perspective on gender is inextricably linked to the study of power.
The source makes this point really starkly by drawing an analogy to why we don't talk about race roles or class roles.
It would sound absurd, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it really would.
Talking about race roles would ignore the immense diversity within racial groups. It would fail to recognize that the behaviors associated with different racial groups are often direct consequences of racial inequality and oppression, not some inherent personality trait.
It misses the context of inequality.
And crucially, it would miss the fact that racial identity is constructed relationally. Whiteness is defined in relation to blackness, often within a historical context of white group power over people of color. As Helen Hacker's classic work on women as a minority group pointed out, there are parallels in how systematic inequality can produce negative self-perceptions in target groups, but we wouldn't use role theory to explain racial oppression.
Because movements for racial or gender equality aren't just about individuals changing their roles. They're about challenging power structures and redistributing resources.
Exactly. And applying role theory to gender, like applying it to race, carries the dangerous risk of blaming the victim.
How so?
If gendered behaviors or disparities are seen as stemming from fundamental personality differences socialized early on, then the responsibility for inequality falls on individuals for not conforming better or overcoming their socialization.
This sounds very similar to what R. Stephen Warner and colleagues critiqued as the Sambo theory of oppression.
Yes, that theory, applied to formerly enslaved people, argued that their seemingly submissive or maladaptive behaviors were due to their having internalized dysfunctional values from the oppressive system, presenting their behavior as a crippled personality.
That's a horrible way to frame it.
It's deeply flawed. In this worldview, social change depends on better future socialization, or on the oppressed group learning to adopt the values and behaviors of the dominant group. And if progress isn't made, it's framed as the fault of the oppressed themselves for not adapting properly. This is a dangerous trap that focusing only on individual roles can fall into.
So power is absolutely central. The source makes the quite controversial argument that gender is a power relation.
It is. It's not just that we have gender differences and then power dynamics emerge. The source argues that power dynamics are fundamental to gender. They produce the very differences we observe.
Power creates difference, not the other way around.
That's the argument. Gender is understood as a system of power relations. Men as a group hold power over women as a group, and certain groups of men hold power over other men, just as some groups of women hold power over other women. You simply cannot explain gender without understanding power.
And this is often where men specifically can feel defensive. Don't blame me, I never did X, or I feel totally powerless in my own life.
That defensiveness is understandable on an individual level, but it sometimes misses the point about group power. It's analogous to how some white people might deny their connection to racial oppression because they personally didn't own slaves.
The individual experience versus the group dynamic.
Exactly. On an individual level, many men genuinely don't feel powerful. They feel constrained by expectations, maybe bossed around by wives, children, or employers.
And the source notes this feeling of individual powerlessness among men is a point where feminist theory can sometimes feel disconnected for them.
Right. For many women, there's a clearer symmetry between group position and individual feeling. Women as a group worldwide are largely excluded from positions of systemic power, and individually, many women feel constrained and powerless by gender inequality.
That aligns.
For men, that symmetry is often broken. Men as a group overwhelmingly hold positions of power relative to women in most institutions, but individual men often do not feel powerful. They feel constrained by the rigid expectations of traditional masculinity.
That feeling of being constrained by stereotypes or feeling individually powerless seems like a driving force behind things like opposing affirmative action or seeking rituals in men's movements or wearing power ties.
It is. It's the search for a feeling of power, sometimes misplaced. Warren Farrell, for example, famously argued that male power is a myth, comparing men to chauffeurs who are in the driver's seat and wear a uniform, seeming powerful, but are actually taking orders and feel powerless.
The chauffeur analogy.
Right. He argued men and women have complementary roles with equally negative stereotypes. Woman as sex object, man as success object.
And that chauffeur analogy does resonate with that feeling of lacking control over one's own life.
It has some limited value for understanding individual feelings, sure, but the source suggests a crucial shift in frame. Ask the chauffeur the gender of the person giving the orders. More often than not, it's another man, often from a dominant group, upper class, white. This highlights that systemic power isn't just about individual roles. It emerges from structures of inequality based on class, race, ethnicity, sexuality, and age.
It's not just about gender in isolation.
No. As the source says, it's particular groups of men, not men in general, who are oppressed. Their situations are related in different ways to the overall logic of the subordination of women to men.
This power isn't like a personal possession you carry around. It's a property of the group.
That's the sociological understanding, drawing on theorists like Hannah Arendt. Power isn't something you have as an individual trait. It's the ability to act together. In concert with others, it's a property of group life.
Power comes from the group.
Someone is in power because a group empowers them. If the group dissolves, that individual's power vanishes. It's not an attitude or thing that can simply be willed away.
And because it's so deeply embedded, so woven into the fabric of our interactions and institutions, it can be invisible, especially to those who benefit from it most.
Precisely. It shapes our lives in profound ways, creating opportunities and constraints, but often goes unnoticed by those for whom the structure works smoothly. It's like the air they breathe.
Okay, so sociology adds difference, power, and institutions. Let's look more closely at how gender plays out across the life course, which we touched on earlier.
Right. Sexual theory was limited here, focusing too heavily on early childhood and struggling to explain the vast differences in gender experiences among different groups and how they change over time.
Because socialization isn't a one-time event that finishes in childhood, is it?
Absolutely not. It's a lifelong, continuous process. It's bumpy, uneven, and far from smooth or finite. While family and school are primary influences early on, peer groups and media become increasingly powerful agents of socialization, particularly as we age.
We keep learning and adapting.
Constantly, these later influences can reinforce or contradict earlier messages, and we're always navigating and sorting out these influences throughout our lives.
And what it means to embody masculinity or femininity changes significantly as we move through different life stages. What felt important in your 20s might be different in your 40s or 60s.
Definitely. While biology provides certain stages like puberty, reproduction, menopause, and physical aging, even these biological realities are interpreted and experienced differently depending on our cultural and social context. Sociologists look at how these biological changes interact with changing social expectations and institutions across the life course.
The source gives the example of the different purported ages for sexual peaks, men around 18, women around mid-30s. How does sociology look at that?
Yes, this is often presented as a purely biological or evolutionary difference. Biological explanations might point to factors like sperm quantity for men or the timing of fertility decline for women, and hormonal changes certainly exist. But the sociological perspective adds the crucial context of marriage and family life.
How does that context explain the difference?
Well, for men, an early peak might reflect a time when their sexual activity feels most exciting and perhaps unconstrained by long-term commitments, embodying an idea of youthful exploration.
Less responsibility, maybe?
Perhaps. For women, the later peak might occur when they are more likely to be in stable, committed relationships that provide the trust and security needed to fully explore their sexuality. The risk of unwanted pregnancy, which is high when you're younger and less settled, isn't exactly conducive to peak sexual exploration for women.
But a stable relationship might change that.
Exactly. It might mitigate that concern and provide the intimacy needed. That explanation, rooted in social context and risk, feels much more compelling than a purely biological one for explaining that particular divergence.
It offers a richer understanding.
Yeah.
Another fascinating example discussed is the midlife crisis.
Yes, the stereotype.
The stereotype of the middle-aged man buying a red sports car and dating someone half his age.
Exactly. This concept was popularized in the 1970s by books like Daniel Levinson's Seasons of a Man's Life and Gail Sheehy's Passages. It felt intuitively right to many people and became a common way to explain behavior in middle age. The stereotype involves men getting divorced, changing careers dramatically, pursuing risky hobbies, or suddenly adopting youthful styles.
Like in the movie City Slickers.
Yeah, the source mentions that as a humorous depiction.
But actual research doesn't really support it as a universal, typical stage, does it?
That's correct. Careful studies, both dating back to the time the concept gained popularity and more recent larger-scale research like the study by Elaine Wethington, have found little empirical support for a universal midlife crisis that affects most men or women.
So it's more myth than reality.
Largely, yes. Midlife certainly presents challenges related to work, health, or relationships, and some people do respond in ways that fit the stereotype. But crises and periods of major life upheaval happen at every stage of life and are triggered by specific events, not simply reaching a particular birthday.
Withington's study was quite clear. Less than 25% of people over 35 reported experiencing one, and half of those described stressful life events rather than a sustained crisis.
It seems the popular belief is sustained partly by confirmation bias. We tend to notice and remember the dramatic, attention-grabbing cases that fit the stereotype. The one guy who fits the whole checklist of divorce, sports car, and skydiving.
While ignoring the dozens who don't.
Exactly. We ignore the vast majority of middle-aged people who don't experience anything resembling a crisis.
Gender also significantly shapes the experience and social perception of aging itself.
Particularly in Western societies, there's a clear double standard. Older men often receive less social stigma than older women.
Gray hair on men is distinguished.
Often seen that way, yeah. Maturity, wisdom, character. Whereas on a woman, they're often seen simply as signs of getting old, something to be fought against or hidden.
And the difference in how older men and women are viewed in relationships is striking.
It's widely accepted, even normalized, for an older man to date or marry a much younger woman. The source contrasts the public reaction to Martha Ray, who was 75, marrying Mark Harris, 42, which generated scandal and suspicion about his motives.
People thought he was after her money.
That was the implication. Compare that to Tony Randall, also 75, marrying Heather Harlan, 50 years his junior, which was often framed positively, praising his vitality with no questions about her motives. Both marriages, incidentally, lasted until the older partner's death.
That's a stark contrast.
It really is, and the media constantly reinforces this, showing older male leads paired with much younger women, while older actresses struggle for roles after 40.
You see it all the time in movies.
Exactly. Look at the common pairings in film, like Michael Douglas with Gwyneth Paltrow, Harrison Ford with Kristen Scott Thomas, or Sean Connery with Catherine Zeta-Jones, who is young enough to be his granddaughter. Meanwhile, actresses in their mid to late 30s are playing mothers, and acclaimed actresses like Jane Fonda or Cher are often in supporting roles as they age. It's a clear demonstration that deciding who is considered old or too old, particularly for women, is very much a cultural and gendered expectation, not simply a biological fact.
So the social experience of aging is deeply gendered. And even retirement and death show gendered patterns.
The source notes that men, often socialized into a model of independent, stoic masculinity, may head into retirement with fewer strong social connections outside of work compared to women.
Who might have stronger family and friend networks.
Often, yes. Women are often socialized to maintain closer networks with family, friends, and colleagues. This potential isolation for men is a health risk factor and might contribute slightly to men's shorter average life expectancy.
And while women do live longer on average, it's not solely due to biology, is it?
No. There are biological factors, differences in immunity, hormonal effects on cholesterol, and research like David Goldspank's suggesting men's hearts may weaken faster with age, though exercise helps. But sociological factors play a huge role, and the gap is decreasing.
How so?
Men aged 18-24 are significantly more likely to die than women of the same age, often due to accidents and risky behaviors linked to performing masculinity, proving themselves, taking risks.
Boys will be boys kind of thing, but with deadly consequences sometimes.
Unfortunately, yes. Men historically spend more time in the public sphere, increasing exposure to workplace hazards, accidents, violent crime, and infectious illness. As gender roles become less rigid and more women work outside the home, the gap is predicted to narrow.
And we see this pattern globally, right? The gap is decreasing in many places, and in some countries, men even live longer than women.
Yes, the gap is closing in diverse countries. Interestingly, the divergence in life expectancy between wealthy and poor countries is actually greater than the gender divergence within countries.
Wealth matters more than gender, globally speaking.
In terms of life expectancy differences, yes. In poorer countries, both men and women face high risks from poor health care, nutrition, violence, and war, with women facing added risks from problem pregnancies. In wealthy countries, better conditions mean both sexes live longer. The prediction is that in coming decades, the gender gap in wealthy nations will be minimal. This again underscores that while biology matters, the social and environmental context is critical.
This links back to the idea of gender as an institution, doesn't it? The point about power being a property of groups, not individuals, flows into gender being embedded in institutions.
It does. This is a major departure from sex role theory. That earlier view tended to see gendered individuals entering gender-neutral institutions. Sociology argues that institutions themselves are gendered.
Not neutral spaces.
Not according to this perspective. They aren't neutral spaces. They are built upon and perpetuate gendered norms, logics, and power dynamics. There's a constant dynamic interaction. Individuals shaped by gender interact within institutions shaped by gender, and this process reproduces both individual identities and broader inequalities.
The source uses that thought experiment. What if all political positions globally were suddenly held by women? What would sociology predict?
Well, someone coming from a biological determinist or sex role theory perspective might predict a fundamentally different, perhaps more peaceful, world based on assumed innate or socialized differences in aggression between men and women.
But that might be too simplistic.
Right. Ironically, those who emphasize these differences are often least likely to support women in power. Someone else might argue, look at figures like Golda Meir or Margaret Thatcher. They were tough leaders. The demands of the office make you act that way, regardless of gender.
And that second view gets closer to the sociological recognition that institutions matter.
Yes, it recognizes that institutions have their own inertia, their own demands and logic that shape behavior. The standard against which leaders are measured can be deeply gendered, as perhaps seen in criticisms of Jimmy Carter being perceived as weak when he wasn't traditionally aggressive.
So it's complicated.
It is. But the sociological perspective isn't simply that institutions are immutable forces that erase individual gender. It's not genderless individuals in neutral institutions, nor is it individuals whose biology completely overrides the institutional context.
It's the interaction.
Exactly. It's gendered individuals interacting within gendered institutions. And in that thought experiment, while the demands of holding political power would certainly influence behavior, having all these positions filled by individuals socialized with certain gendered tendencies, perhaps towards negotiation or different priorities, would likely affect, modify, or even transform the mandates and operations of those institutions over time.
So maybe the world will be a little different.
Perhaps. The source suggests we might sleep a little more peacefully. The example of Nobel laureate Barbara McClintock, the cytogeneticist, is a great illustration of this interaction between a gendered individual and a gendered institution like science.
How so?
She approached her research with what she described as feminine methods, having a feeling for the organism, a more holistic approach than many of her male colleagues who were focused on a more linear, hierarchical model of the master molecule in genetics.
The different way of knowing.
You could say that. Your different approach, which could be seen as influenced by her gendered experience or simply a different cognitive style intersecting with a historically masculine field, led to a revolutionary discovery about the complexity and interaction within cells that challenged the dominant paradigm in biology. Her gender wasn't irrelevant to her scientific process, and her approach, in a way, challenged the gendered logic of the institution.
So understanding gender as socially constructed means we have to locate individual identity within a specific, historically and socially situated context, recognizing that context is itself gendered.
Precisely. It means situating individuals within a complex matrix of biological possibilities, social interactions, cultural expectations, and institutional structures. Sociology helps us examine the interplay of these elements through the prisms of difference and domination.
Identity, interaction, institution.
Those are the three key levels, working together to produce diversity and reproduce inequality. These elements are complexly related and shape our personalities, our relationships, and our life paths. And just as society shapes us, we, through our interactions and engagement with institutions, also reshape society.
It's a two-way street.
Definitely. We are gendered people living gendered lives in gendered societies.
And social constructionism goes further to argue that institutions don't just passively reflect existing gender differences, they actively produce the very differences we often assume are inherent individual characteristics.
Yes, the source emphasizes this, quoting that the extent to which women and men do different tasks strongly influences the extent to which the two sexes develop and/or are expected to manifest widely disparate personal behaviors and characteristics.
So doing different things makes us different.
In a way, yes. The fact that society structures different experiences and tasks for men and women, often within institutions, is what creates the differences we then attribute to fundamental differences in personality or capability between the sexes.
Let's look at a really mundane example the source uses to illustrate this. Public restrooms.
Ah, yes, Goffman. Irving Goffman, a brilliant sociologist, wrote about this in his essay on the arrangement between the sexes. We have the same biological need for waste elimination, right?
Pretty basic need.
Exactly. Yet public restrooms are rigorously segregated by sex, labeled gentlemen and ladies. They often have different designs, urinals in the men's room, perhaps more vanity space in the women's. We see this as completely natural, separate but equal.
But in private homes, families use the same bathroom. There's usually no segregation needed, no urinals, maybe not separate vanity tables.
Exactly. And in some cultures, public functions are performed with no privacy at all. Goffman's question is crucial. If the biological need is the same, why is the public practice so radically different from the private?
The answer isn't biology.
No, he argued it's totally cultural matter. Toilet segregation is presented as a natural consequence of the difference between the sexes, when in fact it is a means of honoring, if not producing, this difference.
So the segregation creates the difference it claims to reflect.
That's the idea. By constantly entering and using sex-segregated public restrooms, we are participating in a ritual that reinforces and creates the categories of gentlemen and ladies who are meant to use them. The physical separation isn't just a consequence of difference. It's a performance that generates and justifies the idea of profound natural difference requiring that separation.
That's a simple but incredibly effective illustration of how an institution actively constructs and reinforces gender categories through its practices.
It is. On a more complex level, consider the workplace. Rosabeth Moss Kanter's classic study, Men and Women of the Corporation, showed that the observed differences in men's and women's behavior in organizations weren't primarily due to individual personality traits, but were linked to the structure of the organization and the positions people occupied.
The job shapes the person.
In large part, yes. Positions themselves carry characteristic images, and the people in them exhibit behaviors necessary for those roles. She found that evaluation criteria, while presented as neutral, were often deeply gendered. While organizations were being defined as sex-neutral machines, masculine principles were dominating their authority structures. Masculinity was the invisible, unexamined norm.
And sociologist Joan Acker expanded on this, arguing that workplaces are key sites where gender differences are not just reflected, but actively reproduced, and where inequality is legitimated. Institutions are like factories churning out gender.
Aker's crucial insight is that gender isn't an optional add-on to organizational processes. It's fundamental. Institutions create difference and reproduce the gender order through gendered processes.
What are those?
These are the ways that power, advantage and disadvantage, exploitation, control, even how we understand action, emotion, and identity within the organization are patterned by the male-female, masculine-feminine distinction.
Okay. She identified 5 such processes. First, the creation of gender divisions.
Yes, how organizations structure jobs, wages, hierarchies, and power along gender lines, often through seemingly neutral practices. Second, how symbols and images within the organization reinforce these divisions. Think of job titles, dress codes, or how success is portrayed.
Third, the dynamics of interaction between individuals.
Patterns of dominance and submission in conversations, like who interrupts whom or whose opinions carry more weight, can reproduce gender differences rooted in the gendered power dynamics of the organizational structure.
Okay.
Fourth, the internal mental work individuals do to understand their place in the gendered structure and navigate expectations, including consciously presenting themselves in gender-inappropriate ways through dress, speech, and behavior.
Managing impressions.
Right. And fifth, the underlying logic of the organization itself, where seemingly objective criteria for hiring, evaluation, or promotion are actually infused with gendered assumptions, often reflecting a masculine standard that's presented as universal and neutral.
So the ideal worker is often implicitly male.
Exactly. Sex role theory's assumption of gendered individuals in neutral sites, or organizational theories assuming genderless employees, completely miss this. The ideal genderless job holder who can work long hours, prioritize career above all, and has family support to handle personal life turns out to be deeply gendered as a man. This unexamined masculine norm reproduces power differences.
And we see this baked into the structure of professional careers, like medical training, corporate law, or academia.
Absolutely. The timing of medical training finishing residency in your late 20s or early 30s is prime career building time, but it also coincides perfectly with peak childbearing years for women.
The biological clock versus the career clock.
Precisely. The long hours and demanding on-call schedules are timed, perhaps unintentionally, to fit a male doctor's life, especially one with a partner handling family responsibilities. Female doctors, now half of students, face immense challenges balancing motherhood with a schedule built around a historically male life course.
Or the structure of corporate law firms demanding impossible hours to make partner.
If you can't consistently bill 50, 60 hours, which requires working 80, 90 hours, leaving no time for life outside work, you're shunted onto a mommy track or daddy track. You might be praised for being a good parent, but your career advancement is stalled.
The path is blocked.
The path to partner is implicitly timed and structured around someone who doesn't have significant family responsibilities or has a partner who shoulders them, which, again, historically describes a man with a stay-at-home wife. Academic tenure often follows a similar rhythm.
Publish or perish.
Right. The period for achieving tenure, your late 20s to early 30s, is when intense research and publication are required, precisely coinciding with peak childbearing years for women. The publish or perish mandate can feel like publishing requires family life to perish because the tenure clock is timed to a male rhythm, specifically one with built-in family support.
So even as institutions become more diverse, different mechanisms kick in to maintain the gender order.
Yes. As sociologists like Jerry Gerson and Elizabeth Pleck noted, when the outer boundaries of institutions become more permeable, letting women enter, the boundaries within the institution become more crucial for maintaining gender distinctions.
Like what?
This includes occupational segregation, channeling women into lower status or secondary positions, and micro-level boundary maintenance.
Like informal social behaviors.
Yeah.
Little things that exclude people.
Exactly. Male-dominated groups might use after-work socializing, specific types of humor, or unspoken dress codes to define who is an insider and who is an outsider. These subtle micro-level interactions reinforce gender distinctions and power dynamics, even when women are in non-traditional roles.
So individuals embedded in these gendered structures, subject to these processes and evaluation criteria, often perceive the resulting differences and inequalities as simply individual outcomes, like it's their fault or just natural.
Precisely. And when the institutional structure or its criteria don't fit women's needs or experiences, the resulting disparities in representation or advancement are interpreted as natural consequences of existing differences between men and women, rather than recognizing that the differences themselves were generated by the very structure that legitimates inequality.
And this also applies to other dimensions of inequality like race, class, or sexuality. The white, middle-class, heterosexual male experience is often the invisible, unexamined norm against which others are measured.
That's the insight of intersectionality, recognizing that these systems of inequality intersect and reinforce each other. Organizational gender neutrality, by pretending these structures and criteria are neutral, often covers up, obscures the underlying gender structure, as Aker puts it.
So pretending neutrality makes it worse.
Yeah. It allows the gender order to be reproduced even when there are stated goals of promoting equality. Institutions reflect and produce difference, and they reproduce an order where men are privileged over women, and certain groups of men, like white, middle-class, heterosexual men, are privileged over other men.
This brings us to the concept of doing gender, which sounds active.
Yes, building on the idea that gender isn't a fixed property we have. Sex role theory implied you acquire a fixed identity through socialization, and then you are masculine or feminine, and society ensures you conform. Identity was seen as permanent, inherent personality.
Like a fixed trait.
Right. But sociologists Candace West and Don Zimmerman offered a crucial corrective. They argued gender is less a fixed identity and more something we do constantly in interaction with others.
A performance.
It's something we perform, enacting prescribed activities and traits, and it's produced in those interactions. They challenged the idea that gender is an inherent thing. What is the basis for sorting people into sex roles? Common sense says primary sex characteristics, genitalia. Biological sex determines socialized gender role.
But in daily life, we don't check genitalia. We rely on secondary characteristics and presentation. How you look, how you act.
Exactly. We look at breasts, facial hair, musculature, how someone dresses, moves, talks. These are the signals we use to categorize someone as a man or a woman. Imagine how unsettling and strange social interaction would be if we constantly had to verify someone's sex by checking their primary characteristics.
It would be impossible.
Pretty much. This idea is complicated by intersex individuals born with ambiguous primary characteristics.
And the source notes the historical practice of surgically reconstructing ambiguous infant genitalia, often based on perceived penis size rather than chromosomes.
Right. A child with ambiguous genitalia might be assigned male if the penis was deemed appropriately sized according to social norms, otherwise female. This reflected a deeply ingrained social assumption that no one labeled male would want to live with genitalia considered too small.
That's prioritizing social norms over biology.
In a way, yes. This practice has drawn significant criticism from scientists, feminists, and intersex people themselves, who question surgery for social conformity rather than health, highlighting that intersexuality challenges the idea that genitals are the sole defining feature of sex. As urologist William Reiner noted, gender identity has far more to do with other important structures than external genitals.
Yet, genitals remain the common-sense location in our culture. The Kessler and McKenna study, showing images with mismatched primary and secondary traits and asking people to identify man-woman, really highlights our reliance on appearance.
Figures with a penis but breasts, hips, and long hair versus a vulva with no breasts, no hips, but body hair and short hair. If genitalia alone determined gender, many people's daily appearance would hide their true sex. If appearance alone determined it, many might appear as a different sex than their biology. It shows how deeply we rely on consistent signals.
And while this might seem like a hypothetical fantasy, media examples show our fascination and discomfort with gender ambiguity. The Crying Game, Tootsie, M. Butterfly, even figures like Marilyn Manson.
And the anxiety or disgust men experience discovering a cross-dressing prostitute they perceived as female is actually male. Confusion about gender is often used as a source of comedy, highlighting how unsettling it is for us when the dualistic categories break down.
The SNL character Pat.
Exactly. Pat, whose gender was constantly debated by others, while Pat remained nonchalant, shows this social pressure to categorize.
We feel a kind of gender vertigo when we can't easily place someone into a box.
Yes, it challenges our foundational dualistic understanding. Real-life passing is complex, but the popularity of these characters shows how crucial gender certainty is to us. Transvestites and cross-dressers, in a way, make the performance of gender visible. They reveal it as an artifice, a form of drag, requiring effort to manipulate props, signs, symbols, behaviors, and emotions to convince others of a desired gender presentation.
Like RuPaul, who embodies the idea that it takes work to make it look effortless. You're born naked and the rest is drag.
A great quote summing it up. Or Allison Lang, who is a husband and father but spends most of his time dressed as a woman, demonstrating that you don't have to live in gender boxes. Transgender people post-surgery sometimes emphasize or even exaggerate traits of their affirmed sex, perhaps reestablishing anatomy as the primary signifier after the transition.
But cross-dressers, in a sense, deeply understand the social constructionist point, that successfully being seen as a man or woman means convincing others through appearance and performance.
And while the boundaries of those gender boxes can feel comforting to some, disruption to our own gender identity or our ability to categorize others can provoke anxiety, confusion, and even violence.
That's a scary thought.
It is. As Susan Stryker, a transsexual woman, has said, if you fall outside that easy definition, a lot of people see you as some kind of monster. Tragically, many transsexual individuals face violence and murder.
The case of Agnes, studied by Harold Garfinkel and psychiatrist Robert Stoller in the late 1950s, is another key example.
Right. She presented as a feminine woman but had a penis, which she saw as a biological error. She knew she was a woman, had felt that way her entire life, and described her childhood being forced into male activities as traumatic.
Her identity was internal, not based on her body.
Exactly. She didn't base her claim to womanhood on her genitalia, which she wanted surgically altered. She referenced her breasts, her lifelong sense of being female, her feelings, behaviors, and choices, presenting these as a natural fact, not a choice. Garfinkel used feminine pronouns for her, acknowledging her self-identified gender and highlighting how gender identity can be profoundly felt, independent of biological markers.
So, understanding doing gender makes the performative aspects visible and highlights the audience that validates or challenges our gender presentation.
And it opens up possibilities for change. As sociologist Suzanne Kessler noted regarding intersexuality, if the authenticity of gender isn't found solely in nature but in the process of proclamation and social validation, then there's potential power to proclaim and validate different ways of being.
If society constructs it, society can reconstruct it.
If society, including institutions like medicine, recognizes this construction, the possibilities for societal transformation regarding gender are vast, maybe leading to what Kessler called gender utopianism.
Perhaps.
But the core sociological point is that gender isn't just something done to us through socialization. We actively create and recreate our identities through our daily interactions within the context of institutions that are themselves gendered.
This perspective can help us understand complex, gendered phenomena like rape. It's a difficult topic, but important to discuss sociologically.
Rape is a difficult but crucial case study because it's overwhelmingly perpetrated by one gender, men, but affects both men and women. It starkly illustrates dynamics of difference and domination.
How do other perspectives view it?
Well, evolutionary biology might see it as a reproductive strategy for some men, ironically insisting rape is a form of sex. Anthropology shows its dramatic variability across cultures, linking high rates to societies where women are devalued. Psychology might focus on individual rapists as sick individuals, suffering from psychological dysfunction or trauma, framing it as a deviation from the norm.
The sick individual model is pretty common.
It is, but sociology offers a different, more radical view.
What's the sociological take?
Instead of focusing solely on the individual as sick or aberrant, sociology looks at how rape can be perpetrated by ordinary, normal men within a culture that, in various ways, legitimates or excuses such behavior. It examines how the threat of rape forces all women to confront the possibility of sexual victimization, which in turn reproduces gender division and inequality.
So it's not just about the perpetrator, but the cultural context and the impact on all women.
Exactly. Sociological studies of rapists often find many are married or in relationships, and gang rape can involve typical guys going along. They often frame their actions through a lens of power and entitlement to women's bodies, seeing it as their right.
Entitlement, yeah.
It's also related to dynamics among men as seen in groups where sexual conquests are scored, or in wartime rape, which functions as a brutal form of communication between male combatants using women's bodies as symbols of victory or conquest.
So while it's an individual act of violence, it's also a systemic social problem for women as a group.
Crucially, yes. Individual women take countless precautions, changing their routes, clothing, habits to avoid potential attack, but the threat hangs over all women. Carol Sheffield termed this sexual terrorism, a system of constant reminders that women are vulnerable targets because of their gender. This knowledge psychologically impacts all women, shaping their behavior and sense of safety.
So sociology sees rape as both a structure of social relations and an individual event.
It's an individual act of violence, certainly, but one that is sustained and made more likely by a cultural context that can interpret it in ways that legitimate or justify it, like blaming the victim's clothing or behavior. This pervasive threat keeps women vulnerable and reproduces fundamental gender differences women as fearful and dependent on men for protection, excluded from certain spaces, and thus reproduces gender inequality.
Bringing it all together then, how should we ultimately think about gender from a sociological perspective? What's the takeaway?
It means exploring those three interwoven levels, identity, interaction, and institution, and understanding their complex relationships to explain both the diversity of gender experiences and the persistent inequality between men and women and among different groups of men and women.
Gender isn't some fixed thing you have, but a dynamic set of activities you do.
That's a great way to put it. Done not in isolation, but in front of others, and constantly judged and validated or challenged by their reactions. It's less an individual possession and more a product of our ongoing interactions. Weston Zimmerman called it a managed property, something we actively construct because we know others are evaluating us.
We manage how we present ourselves.
Constantly. Women and men exist as distinct social groups, engaged in concrete, historically evolving, and generally unequal relationships. As historian E.P. Thompson said of class, gender is a relationship, not a thing. We don't just inherit a role, we actively, interactively define and redefine daily what it means to be a man or a woman. Gender is something one does, not something one has.
And this doing gender is a situated accomplishment happening in every interaction, every situation, within every institution we participate in.
It's both what we bring to the situation, our understanding of gender, our personal history, and what is produced in the moment through our interactions with others and the demands of the setting. But we do it in a world that is already deeply gendered, within institutions built upon systemic inequality based on gender. Social life constantly reproduces both gender difference and gender inequality. Masculinity and femininity are not constructed in a vacuum, but within this evolving unequal structure.
So even our most deeply held beliefs about gender's essential nature are shaped by these larger power relations.
Exactly. As sociologist Catherine Pike puts it, gender is an emergent property of situated interaction. Our core beliefs about what men and women are essentially like shape how we do gender in daily life, but those beliefs themselves are molded by macrostructural power relations. And the culturally accepted ways of doing gender in a given context tend to be those that favor the interests of dominant groups of men, thus reproducing gendered power and inequality.
Sociology's unique contribution, then, is its ability to help us distinguish what is truly different versus what only appears different, and critically, to understand how much of the difference we see isn't the cause of inequality, but its product.
Yes, that's a key insight. We are gendered people, living gendered lives in a gendered society. And it's on this planet that those differences are made to matter in profound ways. The chapters to come will explore how these dynamics of identity, interaction, and institution play out in specific arenas of life, families, schools, workplaces, and in fundamental human relationships like love, sex, friendship, and violence.
So as you reflect on this deep dive, maybe consider this. Given that gender is less something we are intrinsically and more something we do, constantly shaped by our interactions in the institutions around us, how much of what we've always considered natural gender difference is actually a product of the way our society is structured?
It's a big question.
What opportunities or constraints might this understanding reveal? not just for how we live our own lives, but for how we might collectively imagine and build a different kind of society. Something to think about.